Wow, okay. We're about to start, so please take your seat. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and I have the daunting task of introducing John Elkington. I've met John during COVID, and I've called him and I asked him to sort of deliver one of the first webinars of the Gerhard Center. And it was about something he coined expression. It's called green swans. You can ask about it later on, but it's really the counter attack for black swans, Nassim Taleb. His argument is that innovation, technology-based, would actually eventually do exponential growth and would actually get us out of many of the issues, social, environmental, that we face. Now, I asked him to serve in the board of the Gerhard Center, and then he said, I'll answer you later. Now, he came, and he tells me, everybody tells me not to do it because it's just, I'm swamped. But then he told me something interesting. He said, I'm going to do it because I have an affinity to Egypt. So I was asking him, what is this affinity about? Now, apparently, John was 50 years ago in Egypt, and he was working with UNDP, right? Project in Ismailia and in Lake Manzala. So this is like a 50-year comeback. John is referred to as the father of sustainability. And I said he's on the board of the Gerhard Center, and I talk to him every now and then just to get some sort of inspiration, new ideas, and connections. When you look at some of our webinars at the Gerhard Center, we owe it to him. So he's been referred to as the father of sustainability. One of the things that he introduced, but then he mentioned that he had to do a recall to fine-tune it, is the concept of a triple bottom line. You all heard about it, right? Now, I don't want to take too much of the time. I want to let John do the talk. The way we're going to do it, he's going to talk for half an hour, 45 minutes. Kariman Shoair, my colleague from the Gerhard Center, will moderate, just to make sure that the questions and answers are reasonable. We have until 2:30 or 2:45. Ask all the questions you want. You don't get the chance to sort of meet a guru every day. Okay, so without much ado, John.
First thing to say is I'm not a guru, but thank you, Dr. Ali. It's fantastic to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, the discussion. If you don't ask a question or make a comment, I'll give you my email at the end. It's john@volans.com. Please do use it. I answer every email that's sent. The last couple of days, I've really enjoyed some sessions here at AUC and at the Gerhard Center and meeting people involved in finance, in accounting, in social entrepreneurship, and so on. And I've really found it absolutely, I've been coming up a very steep learning curve. But what I'm going to do now, at Dr. Ali's request, is just to run through some slides. I hope that fits with your expectations. And if any of you suddenly in the middle of this want to ask a question, just put up a hand or throw a chair at me and I'll respond. But there'll be plenty of time at the end. So if I can have the first slide, please. or the slides. Hurrah! There is a slide before this, but doesn't matter, and it's just talking about the theme of the presentation, which is we're hearing a lot about capitalism for all sorts of different reasons, but we're also hearing about not just green or sustainable or responsible or resilient capitalism, we're hearing about regenerative capitalism. So my question here today, is that a fact or is it fiction of some sort? Now the reason I've got this, some of you will recognize the Dragon capsule that SpaceX puts up into orbit quite often. And I've often wondered if I was given one wish for something I would really like to happen in our world, what would it be? And one of the wishes I would have is that every billionaire, well, every trillionaire now, every billionaire, every millionaire, could be sent up into space for at least probably 2 to 3 days. I don't mean to lose them entirely, but there is this thing called the overview effect. And I've met a number of astronauts and one cosmonaut. And as you may well know, when people come back from space, they see the world differently. They think differently. And this is one of these moments where I think all of us, in one way or another, need to go through something like that process. Now, as Dr. Ali has kindly said, I'm known in different parts of the world for being quite keen on the idea of sustainability. And that goes back many, many years. But the problem with the world that we live in is that if you're keen on a concept, on an idea, there will be other people in, for example, the advertising industry who, for a period of time, thinks, well, that's a lovely idea, so they start to play with it. So suddenly everything becomes sustainable. Well, I'm partly here to say that we are not even on the starting points of dealing with many of our sustainability challenges. And we've got another problem. I was 7 years on the faculty of the World Economic Forum and heard people like this, mercifully not Donald Trump, but certainly Mark Carney when he was governor of the Bank of England. And this year, those of you who've been watching the media will have seen this exchange where Mark Carney, now Prime Minister of Canada, went on stage before Trump and basically said, you know, our whole system has now been taken hostage, captured by what's happening in the United States of America. And in the speech, which he wrote himself, now many of you will have read the speech. If you haven't, it's not that long. There's a very good video, about 17 minutes. I recommend it really highly. So we talk about sustainability as though it's easy. It's something that we're going to automatically experience and achieve. This is the reality which we're now moving into, which is a very, very energetically disrupted world. And it's not just Trump. This isn't just simply coming from one individual. So a very quick series of slides to explain who I think I am. Again, as Dr. Ali said, 50 years ago, 1975, I was working in Ismailia, I was working in the Nile Delta, and I won't tell you any of that story, but that was the most critical element in my entire working life. Partly because I was working with governments then, and I found that bribery and corruption and incompetence and all sorts of things were quite widespread in that area. Lots of great people, lots of fascinating people, but I decided to work with the private sector, business, financial markets. I'm afraid you will see this character a number of times through my slides. It's meant to be representative of my role in the world, but also representative of a much wider set of movements, social movements, economic movements, political movements around the world. So a couple of things that I'm not, just so that you're prepared and your expectations are well managed. I'm not an academic. I make no apology for it, it just happens to be a fact. But I do have visiting professorships at 3 universities, and I really treasure those relationships. I'm not an economist. I went to university for the first time in 1967, which is where I met my wife, Elaine, who sits in the front here after 58 years. Sometimes people ask me, how do you keep going? And my answer is sitting in the front row here. So I'm not an economist, but I'm fascinated by economics. And then I'm not a pessimist. I was born an optimist. I believe that progress is not only possible, but is going to happen. The question is just how. And that 10 to 15 number is based on the fact that I think the next 10 to 15 years, when many of you will come out into the working environment, are going to see more change than the last 50 years of my working life. Now, it doesn't mean that's going to be good change. It doesn't mean it's going to be bad change, but change is going to happen. The question is, how do we all work together to make sure that it takes us in the right direction? So what I am, I like change. I think change is necessary. I work on that. I advise different organizations around the world. So, for example, I've served now on over 80 boards and advisory boards in different parts of the world. I'm an entrepreneur. I didn't set out to be an entrepreneur. I did it because nobody else would employ me. I set up organizations that did the sorts of things that I wanted to do. And I set up 4 businesses, social purpose businesses, since 1978. They all still exist, much more to do with other people than me, because I'm completely numbers blind. So I need accountants. I need people who can do the numbers. And then also I write for my sins. But in 1991, this was finished in 1992, we have a newspaper called the Financial Times. And then, and still today, their best cartoonist was a man called Ingram Penn. And I said, would you try and capture for me what I think the agenda in business looks forward and related to leadership looks like in the future? You probably decode it quite quickly. So the fish in the business suit represents nature and nature's voice in the world of business. The woman in the middle, probably from the Indian subcontinent, but represents the poor, the dispossessed, the have-nots. And that remains an enormously urgent priority, even if a country like China has pulled 300 million Chinese people out of poverty. And then you had this character, and that was really sort of a joke. 3001, we've got to think about the deep future. It's no longer a joke. Robots in the form of expert systems are now sitting around more and more board tables and bringing artificial intelligence into senior leadership discussions in the world of business and of finance. So just recently I asked, I think it was Artiforia, AI platform, just do that cartoon, but in today's terms. And it's just quite interesting that the woman here is not obviously poor. Things have moved on, and I find that sort of quite exciting, but in the real world, perhaps they haven't moved on quite far enough. And a lot of the work that I've done over the last 15 years, I didn't set out to do this, but it's been board level, C-suite level, sort of the senior executives in major companies. And as I said, I write. So these are the 2 latest books. The one on the left, Dr. Ali has already referred to, and it looks at exponential solutions to exponential problems. And this one just looks back right the way through my life of 76 years to date, 50 plus years of working in this space, and just gives some of the lessons learned along the way. So where are we in all of this? You'll have your own views. I look forward to hearing some of those in a moment. But we're in one of those critical moments. They don't happen that often. They happen every 50 to 60 years. There's no exact rhythm, but they happen not very frequently. And most of us have a sense that the world is changing all around us. We don't quite know where that's going to take us. We don't know what the implications are. But many people now know that there are a set of challenges out there that some would characterize, explain as wicked or even super wicked. They almost seem to resist solution. And part of the reason for that is that we face systemic challenges. So, early last year, with GlobeScan in Canada, they're based in Toronto, ERM, which is based all around the world, it's a consultancy, and my own organization of Valence, we went out to the sustainability profession. So this was experts right around the world. And we asked a lot of different questions. All of this is up on the internet if you want it. But the one that I absolutely insisted went in was this one. And it was a very simple question. What do you think about the current state of the change and sustainability agenda? I have to say we were shocked. I expected something of the sort, but we were shocked. Because 93% of the people working at very senior levels in over 70 countries around the world said that the sustainability agenda now needs to be transformed, and 56% of those people said it needs radical work. Now that's your challenge. It's not just people like me who are going to do that. People like you are going to have to work on that, probably for much of the rest of your career. Or careers. Now, this is a very, you won't be able to read it. It's a very busy, or there are many different elements here in this diagram or mapping. The higher up here you have, the higher the impact and the higher the feasibility, the likelihood of these sorts of issues. And the only message I want to take you to take away from this is that almost whatever somebody like Donald Trump decides to ignore or push back against or whatever, there are a massive number of different challenges that different governments and ministries and different businesses and their supply chains and financial markets and so on are going to have to deal with. And one of the things that's quite interesting, for at least for me, is that some of the stuff that the United Nations, I love the United Nations, but it has problems. One of the things that is very clear is right down at the bottom for 840 plus experts around the world are things like the Sustainable Development Goals. They're important, they're useful to have, but they're not driving real systemic change. And then just breaking the boundary here, you have AI, artificial intelligence, which has the potential to change everything, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. And this is Egypt. This is the same company, GlobeScan, looking at some of the issues here. And it's interesting to see what is top of mind. This is 1,000 citizens interviewed. AI, still very much lower down, but with the potential to come up. Issues like extreme poverty, climate change and fresh water there, but the tensions in the region, war and conflict. So all of these things are not going to go away. So that go back to where I started. What is regenerative capitalism? What does that look like? Where do we see it in the world? I've visited many industrial sites around the world. I worked in over 50 countries. And I've seen, this is just a cartoon, but it's indicating that industries, even entire economies, die, and then new things sometimes come up in their space. But this is what we mean by regenerative. I'm not going to go through this. Anyone who wants the slides, we can provide them. But in a way, the sustainability agenda sits somewhere here. And what you have is what most people are currently doing at the moment, which is degenerating nature and environmental systems and so on. They don't mean to, but it's part of what they do. And what we need to move towards is a world where regeneration, not just natural, not just biological, not just ecological, this is economic, it's social, it's political regeneration that we also need now. And so you already got again, it's this problem. When you use language, people start to play with it, they start to use it. So you've got people now talking about regenerative capitalism. Walmart, for example, PepsiCo, Unilever, Danone, Nestle, all these major food companies are now saying we're going to become regenerative in the same way that they used to talk about being sustainable. So the question, is regenerative capitalism fact or fiction? It's a fiction, absolutely no question, in exactly the same way that when African slavery was the heart of a huge, great international economy, it would have been fictional to say that's going to end. But it did end. It doesn't mean that slavery has ended, but that's economic system did come to an end. The other thing I'm just going to make a point here, the second bullet point, it's very easy to think that something is impossible because you don't see its possibility or potential, and because you don't see evidence of that trend or emerging reality. But something that already exists somewhere in the world is very unlikely to be impossible. So one of the things I do, and I've done it for many, many years, is to try and get out to different parts of the world to see what's happening on the ground. So early last year, for the first time ever, I've been to Brazil many times, but I went to Amazonia. And I went hosted by a very major Brazilian company called Natura. And we went around different parts of Amazonia to see the way in which their supply chain has been re-engineered to ensure the social regeneration, the ecological regeneration of the systems that they depend upon. So where are we headed? What's next? Well, the way I think about it, this is not a model for the future. This is the personal compass that I'm using to steer my own work. I was forced to give up science when I was 14. I refused to cut up frogs. At that time, you had to cut up living frogs to do your biology exams. I didn't want to do that. So I was told I couldn't do science in general. But science is absolutely critical. And the trouble is, at the moment, many people, for example, the President of the United States, are just ignoring science. But we've really got to pay attention to that to inform our politics, our markets, and then centrally what business and financial markets do over time. So let me just say a couple of things about science. It is under challenge in a way that I don't remember in my entire working life, and yet it's more important. And there are new concepts coming up in the sustainability space, like quantum sustainability, which I won't discuss unless you ask questions, but I think are very exciting indeed. So, I mean, clearly these images are not real. I use AI to create them. This is not Donald Trump. But this is what he is in many ways doing. It's what we did as children, which is to think if we block our eyes, if we can't see something, it goes away. Well, I don't know how it worked for you as children, but it didn't work terribly well for me, and it's not going to work out very well for the United States, or perhaps this particular president. And one of the problems is the science is now indicating much more serious systemic challenges than most of us probably are aware of. In 2003, with Elaine, I was invited by the director of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. It's the leading scientific institution in the world looking at atmosphere science and ocean science, to go to Woods Hole on Cape Cod and talk to their scientists. As we came out, one of the scientists we talked to that day said something I've never forgotten. He said, the thing to remember about your part of the world, in my case that is Northwest Europe, and your country, in this case Britain, is by the late 2060s, the early 2070s, your weather conditions will be equivalent to Siberia today. It's taken quite a lot of time for that sort of science to, in fact, most people still have no consciousness of it. Why? Because there's this massive system of currents that take salt and hot, warm water to different parts of the world, and it's failing. When we were there in 2003, they'd been monitoring critical elements of this, been failing. Now it's only just now that you're starting to get the popular media starting to pick up the same story. And this sort of shift is what, in the end, brings civilizations down. Also wealth divides, there are many other factors that play into it. But we face a really systemic crisis here. And then along comes AI. So this is Time magazine. Many of you will have seen their front covers, plural covers. I happen to be slightly contrarian in this space. I think we cannot achieve anything like sustainability without the use of AI. That standard issue, human brain, is not adequate to deal with the challenges that we now face. So we absolutely, I believe, need AI. No question, huge energy problems, huge water problems, and so on. On the scale, I don't know whether any of you have visited some of these data farms. The one that Facebook is just building is the scale or the size of Manhattan. These are very, very big industrial installations. But beyond that, we're starting to see the technology being used for protein folding, for identifying new drugs, and I'll give a case study in just a second about rare earth metals, which have been very, very prominent in the international media. I'm going to speed up just a little, but this is about the business agenda going forward. And anyone who pays attention to what major brands, major companies are doing, and I've worked with most of these companies over the years, are doing, many of them are pulling back. Many of them are saying, we committed. Well, take Mercedes-Benz up at the top. I was with them about a year ago, about 6 or 7 days after their CEO had gone public, to say, we are no longer committed to delivering 100% electric vehicles by 2030. Well, my response to that was, that's your choice. But if you want to write a suicide note to the market, go ahead. Because what's happening is that China, through companies like BYD, is storming into the market with electric vehicles, some of which are beginning to get to the point where you can recharge them in 5 minutes, which is not the typical experience. The sort of work we do, this is a Spanish company, it's an energy and infrastructure, it's called Acciona. Sort of work we do is to work with the rising talent in major international companies to help them decide which way their company should go in future. And in this particular case, the chairman of the company, the owner of the company, said, develop a 5-year strategy for this company. At the end of the process, these young people, 27 from right the way around the world, said, no, we're going to do a 10-year strategy, and no, it's not going to be independent, it's going to be for the company as a whole. And that strategy is going to be around regeneration. So it's very interesting to see how these things play through. I mentioned rare earth metals. Many of you were watching what's happening in the market now with China, which has a choke point on rare earth minerals and metals, basically saying we're only going to give them, or we're only going to supply them to people who do what we want. So there's a German company, it's called Grob. It produces electromagnets for things like electric vehicles. So they started to scratch their heads and think, is there some way that we can do what we do, but without rare earth metals, or with a lot less? They work with a range of different partners. They used AI to screen over 100 million different combinations of metals, which was no way they could have done just using human brains. And what they found at the end of it is you can actually make electromagnets with no rare earth metals. Even more interesting, the R&D process goes twice as fast. The carbon footprint is 70% reduced. And a critical factor for anyone who's paying the attention to the financial bottom line is that this can be 80% cheaper. And that's the sort of result that increasingly AI is potentially giving us. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important. So markets, there's only one slide here, but absolutely fundamental. Companies, businesses, and their supply chains respond to market pressures. That's why all of these companies are backing off the public commitments they've made on climate change and things like that. But over time, we're going to find markets much more actively involved in this space. At the moment, this isn't China, but one of the things that happened just 2 years ago was the head of responsible investing at HSBC, a big bank, basically said in public, big mistake, he lost his job because of it, was who cares if Florida and Miami are underwater in 2100? That's not my business. That's not what we're in business to think about. As I say, he lost his job, but he did us a service, because we need to think about how markets think. And so far, at least, they don't think in ways that make sense here. I was in Spain on the day that this happened. Some of you may remember that the entire Spanish and large part of the Portuguese electricity grids shut down. Why? Well, much of the commentary was about, well, it's too much renewable energy coming into the system. As just an example, you can deal with one problem, but you create second-order problems. We will manage to do that. We just got to think further ahead. Now, some of you may have studied the history of transportation systems. This is two things. This is, the orange line is horses, the white line is cars. And there is one remarkable pair of photographs that goes back to the early part of the 20th century. And it shows a Manhattan street. And in the street, there are lots of vehicles. It's completely crowded with vehicles. And the first image shows it's all horse-drawn carriages and one car. The second image, exactly the same street, exactly the same perspective, shows all cars, one horse-drawn carriage. What's the difference in years between those two? It was 6 years only that it took for that switch to happen. And some of the switches that are coming at us will take perhaps a little bit longer, but be equally dramatic. Wealthy country, Norway, but look at what they've done in driving internal combustion engines off the road and bringing electric vehicles in. This is now over 90% electric vehicles in the Norwegian market. And then just a final comment there, which is in 2007, I joined a very small organization in Paris called EcoVadis in an advisory role. There was then 6 or 8 people. They were tracking a few dozen companies. If you look at what they're doing now, it's over 2,000 people. They're tracking over 150,000 businesses around the world. So again, whatever happens in politics, these new styles of doing business are going to continue, I believe, and scale. A couple of final points around politics and the need to reinvent our political systems over time. So how do we get ordinary people, that's all of us, to vote with the future very much more in mind? Well, it's a difficult challenge. If you're in politics, you've got this sort of pushback. These are farmers in France protesting bans on chemicals, bans on carbon emission-based problems around energy systems. So we will see a lot of protests. And we've seen it against the chemical industry with forever chemicals. We've seen it in Germany with heat pumps. That's not going to go away. And at the same time, you've got people, in particular Donald Trump, trying to push back on areas of the new economy like wind power. Well, good luck, because wind power is going to storm in and take over many energy markets, which energy companies and oil companies and so on currently depend on. I don't know how many of you have seen this diagram. So this is the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, beginning of this year. And these are all of the people going there, thousands of people, were asked what are the critical issues for the next 2 years and the next 10 years. So you've got armed conflict, you've got societal polarization, you've got cyber hacking, misinformation, disinformation, all of that stuff. We all are acutely aware of that in our different lives. But look 10 years out, and I'm not going to go through them, but 5 of those critical issues are now environmental in one form or another. So that's the nature of the systemic crisis. So my font has slightly changed in the transition. I apologize for that. But final set of slides. So Dr. Ali talked about green swans. I won't read out this text, but it's simply to say that the idea of a green swan is that these are, as I said earlier on, exponential solutions to exponential problems. And why am I optimistic? Well, our economies, whether we like it or not, whether we recognize or not, go in these great waves. And when I was studying economics for 1 year back in the 1960s, there were two economists that really struck with me and stayed with me. Nikolai Kondratiev at the top, Joseph Schumpeter in the middle, both saying the same thing. Economies do not evolve in straight lines, they go in cycles. And there's another cycle building. And who sits on top of that cycle? I think, at least for the moment, it is China. And I've done work there, and I've seen some of this at close quarters. But at the same time, you're getting responses. So in the European Union, 10 countries have just come together to build a shared electricity grid right the way around the North Sea to bring wind power into the European market. So that's the scale of the challenges I think we'll increasingly see and need to see. A couple of final slides. One of the things that makes me particularly interested in where we're going and excited and to some degree optimistic is that we're reaching a point in our history where younger people take over. And I was at a session yesterday where somebody was saying, this is not going to be a process where people just want to be invited to take over. They're going to take the baton. They're going to take over. So I'm a baby boomer, so in the middle. It's not that long before we're retired or dead, out of the way. Bunch of younger people are going to come in through with their own very particular values. And I think in many ways that's exciting. This is the last slide. And this is somebody commenting on the World Economic Forum event this year. And just saying that he saw, and a really impressive analyst, 3 types of reaction. One is the hoarder, the decision maker, the choice maker who tries to cling on to what was, building walls, introducing tariffs, and so on, retreating from the global market. In the middle, you have people who try and manage the old system as it declines, or in some cases, moves towards collapse. And then there is the third category, and I hope that most of you fall into that. I mean, many of you will be managers, many of you will be part of processes that try and restore what was. But these are the people who are trying to move the world towards a very, very different form of wealth creation and distribution. That's critical to say. That's all I wanted to say to you. I thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, John, for a very inspiring presentation. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. But if you don't mind, I want you to talk a little bit about something that you hinted at yesterday about AI not being just a technology.
Yeah.
I'm sure, like, we have a lot of young people here, and people are worried about the future, the competition between the US and China over AI, technology and advancement. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for the question. And how many people here do not use AI? Well, it's probably an embarrassing thing to put your hand up on, but I mean, it looks as though most of you use it. And it's entering our lives in extraordinary ways, some of which is visible, and some of which we're completely unaware of. It's being used by the companies that support our lifestyles, and so on. In the time that I've been alive, there have been these races between the superpowers. So, for example, it used to be, United States versus Russia or the Soviet Union, as was on missile technology. Now it's a race around AI, and there is this very real sense, both in China and in America, that if they lose that race, they lose the future. I don't think about it quite that way. I think that there will be crises. People who make a lot of money at this stage of the game will suddenly lose a lot of money or lose their businesses when the crash comes. I think that within 12 to 18 months there is going to be a very major correction, market correction with AI. But in future, I think most of what we do as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as economies, will be enabled by, increasingly directed by AI. The problem, and I just very quickly underscore a problem that I see. About 7 or 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago now, I thought, well, AI, who's behind this? Who are the companies driving these technologies? So I went to see some of them, just decided I wanted to do it. So I went to see, for example, DeepMind before they were acquired by Google, a range of other people. And I found a couple of things which I found quite striking. The first one, that the people I was dealing with in those sorts of companies developing AI were about a third of my age. So probably about your age, some of you. The second thing was that their brains worked about 15 times faster than my brain works. I mean, just extraordinary intellects. But the third thing was that almost all of them were interested in sustainability. They all wanted to make a contribution in this space. So I think the potential to engage these people is considerable, but the problem that I see when I talk to these companies is, and I ask them, who from the sustainability world do you connect with? Who comes and knocks on your door? Who wants to see what you're doing and think about the consequences? The answer is almost nobody. How many of the organizations that you're actively involved in are actually going and not just reading the media about AI, but getting into the conversation about what sort of AI, used how, owned by whom, all of these sorts of questions. And I think that's something we really need to do very rapidly. And any of you working on research or theses or projects or whatever in that space, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, John. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Can you take this one?
There is a microphone. And your questions or your comments can be as rude or as personal or as challenging or as provocative as you want. I don't guarantee to answer them all.
I have a loud voice. It's fine. It's fine. I teach here in. I teach one of the courses that I teach is about sustainability.
Fantastic.
So I know that you said that you are not an academic, but I want to tap on this point because you said that you taught before. I am an academic. And I just learned so much about regenerative capitalism. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Also Ali, for introducing us to Mr. Elkington. Should we talk about regenerative capitalism as its own separate topic, or should we include it as part of sustainability? Should we scrap sustainability at all and just talk about regenerative capitalism? What do you think?
I love the question, and thank you for it. And the answer, you would expect me to say this. No, we should not scrap sustainability, because in a way that is a concept like honesty, like liberty, like democracy, or whatever it happens to be, that's out there somewhere. It's something that we aim towards. But if we think that just talking about it is going to redirect our societies, that's a mistake. So I think of sustainability as almost like a compass point. It's something that we're moving towards. Within that, you then have to think about different sectors. And capitalism is only one part of our economic world, and markets are co-created, co-evolved by lots of different actors. I mean, consumers, obviously, manufacturers, investors, governments who regulate, and so on. So you're exactly right in picking out the question around what are we talking about here? And as a species, human beings are quite, there's a characteristic which we like the new. We like the sparkly thing. We were looking at fashions earlier on here in social entrepreneurs creating textile-based fashions. And there was a lot of sparkle in there. And Egyptians like their sparkle. Well, that's what we're like as a species. We like the sparkly new thing. And regeneration is being treated by many people as one of those sparkly new things. They'll play with it for a while, and then they'll drop it. The reason I embrace regeneration, I think it's much harder to game, to pretend that you're doing, to do the regeneration, washing side of all of this. Because if you are properly regenerative, if you're Nestle, if you're Walmart, or whoever it might be, you're going to have to prove that you are regenerating soils, you're regenerating forests, you're regenerating coral reefs, you're regenerating communities. So it's much harder to demonstrate that than just simply saying, I'm sustainable, good night and good luck. I'd love to know more about the work that you're doing, because I have great... Ali, if I guess one final point. For most of my career, when I started, the university sector and business schools were really interesting. That's where some of the really useful work was being done. Then there was about a 30-year period where universities became utterly boring, forgive me, but a lot of what they did was recycling of what others were doing. And now suddenly again, universities and business schools, not all of them, some of them are becoming much more interesting. So again, I'd love to know more. Dr. Ali. Shall I give you this?
Okay, it's a quick question. I was actually very intrigued by your curve, which shows how fast cars replaced horses. But there is a very good reason behind it, and it's a crisis. In most big cities, there was a problem of horse manure. Whether in Manhattan and London, they were talking about it's going to be like 2 feet of horse manure. So there is a visible issue that you have to take care of, and the solution was cars. Now, I don't see this switching from fossil to electric cars. Yes, there are more CO2 emissions, but it's not as visible, or for most people, as an urgent crisis that forces a change. Now, I hope you agree with me that most of the time change is prompted by, fast change is prompted by a crisis or a dire need. Otherwise, it will take time. Thank you.
This will take time, absolutely no question. And I did mention when I was talking about the replacement of horses by cars, that if we then think about the replacement of electric vehicles, them replacing internal combustion engines, that's going to take quite a long time. But there are many other factors now involved, one of which, I happen to drive an electric car. It's a bit of urban sculpture. I don't drive it enough to make it really worth our family's while. But I just wanted to experiment. It's a far better car than any other car I have ever had. And because it's a technology, it's on this extraordinarily rapid exponential learning curve. So I don't know how many of you have been in electric vehicles, but their quality, including particularly from China now, is extraordinary. And their cost is coming screaming down. And that's why I say that you've got the hoarders in the board of companies like Mercedes-Benz who are saying, we want to cling on to, for example, the European market for internal combustion engines because we know how to do that. And I'm saying to them, well, good luck with that strategy, because history suggested some of these crossover points come much faster than we might imagine. Then to your question, Dr. Ali, I think climate change, for most of us, most of the time, still feels out there. It feels a long, long way from our lives. If you're an insurance company, or you're a reinsurer, so you insure the insurance sector, what you're seeing is the cost of natural disasters, just doing this, it is going, again, exponential. So the question is, Are we waiting here for politicians and consumers or citizens to see what's happening in the wider world, or will some of this come as a market response? I said yesterday at another meeting, my home, our home, in the 2060s will be underwater. It's part of London, it's by the Thames. The levels of sea rise that are coming at us are going to be quite substantial. Now, I know that. Am I moving? Are we moving? Not yet. But the insurers are starting to pay attention. So they're starting to say, we're not sure that we want to insure your home, because at one stage that used to be part of a floodplain. How many parts of the Nile Delta once used to be floodplains, and once the Mediterranean starts to rise, not just by a few inches, but by meters, how many parts of your economy, how many sort of existing parts of development that people have invested in thinking this is forever will suddenly find themselves inundated? So I think one of the things that interests me and to some degree excites me is that market mechanisms are starting to play into the space and putting pressure on some of these big companies. Is it fast enough? No. Will it change fast enough? Probably not. But you're exactly right to say horse manure, horse shit in sort of the streets of New York meant that if you were in a hospital, your bed was surrounded by flies, which were breeding in that sort of waste. So we don't have anything quite like that yet, but I wouldn't count on it not coming through in very short order. I do see some other hands, so how are we going to deal with this?
Okay,
Kaliman.
we have questions.
There's one over there, there's one
Just raise
down
your
here.
hand and we're going to call on you. Shireen.
Hi, so I have
Hi.
just a bit of a thought, but we started with the Millennium Development Goals, and these never really got achieved, and then we went to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Are we going to a regenerative sort of development goals?
How many people here have worked with or work with who have parents working for the United Nations system? Quite a lot of you. I think the UN is going to disappear. I don't say that with any delight. I think it's just the reality. And again, somebody at the session yesterday was saying, if you look back, and he was a diplomat, a former ambassador, he was saying, if you look at the First World War, it gave us the League of Nations. The League of Nations proved very problematic, very weak, and died. The Second World War gave us the United Nations. That has been stronger, it's lasted longer, it's done excellent work. But I think we're going to see that order that the UN has helped steer and shape. Even Antonio Guterres has said that just in the recent days, saying, you know, the UN really risks going bankrupt. Now, back to the question of Millennium Development Goals. Do I want that to happen? No. Would I like a process where we took a blank sheet and say, global governance, how do we do that in the rest of the 21st century? And how do we do it with climate change and all these other things in mind? That I would support. And I don't think the UN, as it's currently configured, is the answer to that set of questions. But the likelihood is if we suddenly shut something like that down, we'll get something much worse in its space. Millennium Development Goals, they were ambitious. They would have been nice to have. They did direct thinking and some practice and so on. Did they deliver? They didn't. Sustainable Development Goals, an even broader range of ambitions, 17 goals and the rest of it. I love the colors. I love the design of them. I mean, for a long period of time, people were wearing these lovely little badges. I never did. And the reason I never did is I never thought that the Sustainable Development Goals, or the Millennium equivalent, were strategies. They were sort of broad sketches of a vision, but they were not strategies how the world would go forward. So do we do a next iteration for that? I think we get to 2030, which, as you know, is the closing date for the Sustainable Development Goals, and we will find that we have had an abject failure. Already, you start to see about it's equal weighted, but there are a lot of these things failing and a few of them sort of coming through. Do I say that with any joy? Absolutely not, because I think as a species we want to see success. And when we see failure, we sort of point fingers and try and blame different people. I'd love to know what your solution would be when the SDGs don't deliver as many people might expect. They've been a lovely rallying call. It's like a flag that you can, or 17 flags that you can wave. But no, something in me tells me that in the next 3 to 5 years, for many of you, the early phases of your careers, there is going to be a massive dislocation in the global system. And every time in history never repeats itself. We all know that. But every time we've gone through one of these cycles, in the middle of the down wave, there is always and always and always a war. Now people will say, Ukraine, we've got the war. No, that's like the Spanish Civil War, where people tested their weapons. There is a major conflict coming, whether we like it or not. It will be fought in different ways than we can possibly imagine. You look at, 15 years ago, and you talked about drone swarms to generals. They wouldn't have recognized that as a threat. They wanted their supercharged fighters. Final point, just to be optimistic, and I know that sounded slightly pessimistic. I saw 1 or 2 people putting their heads in their hands. During the lockdown period of COVID-19, I found myself in a very strange position, which is working with generals and admirals and air marshals in the United Kingdom, Ministry of Defense people. And after decades of working with CEOs, chief executive officers of major companies, I found those people more attuned to, better informed on, more prepared to act on the sorts of issues that we're going to have to deal with, including water security issues, including energy security issues, including demographic changes. We're going to a period where a country like China is going to go from 1.3 or 1.4 billion people to 750 million by the end of the century. Just think of what that does to society and its geopolitical role. Japan, same problem. Italy, the same problem. We're going to see this in many different countries. So don't rule, this is sensitive in a country like this, but do not rule out some of the leaders in the military sector, because some of them are starting to be forced to think about all of this in a very different way.
Thank you, John. Other questions?
There was one over
We
here.
have one there at the back.
I would like to thank you for this great presentation. And my question is particularly political rather than business related. And it was about a statement that I read on the slides, which is China is controlling most of the earth minerals, and that's a problem. And my question is, why is that a problem?
Okay.
And whether it is with the US, let's say, under the current regime, or with another country that is weaker than China, would that still be a problem, or do you think it would be a better alternative than China?
No, thank you. It's a great question. And different people in this audience and different people in the wider world would have very different answers to that question. Let me be personal. I've worked in China, as I mentioned a moment ago. One of the times that I was there, I saw their control of rare earth metals in real time. So what happened was that Japan got very disturbed because China accused Japan of having a military ship that rammed or collided with a Chinese trawler, a fishing boat. So China cut off rare earth metal exports to Japan for a week. As you all know, Japan has a just-in-time economy. So it doesn't warehouse, it doesn't store ingredients, it exports them, imports them continuously. So parts of Japanese industry had to shut down. And then what happened and this is a personal reflection, but then what happened was that the Japanese government released a video of that particular incident that the Chinese were so angry about. And it showed very clearly the Chinese fishing vessel accelerating into the Japanese coastal protection vessel. So who was wrong there? The Chinese. Did they accept it? No. But did they weaponize their control of rare earth metals? Absolutely. And are they doing it again now? Absolutely they are. Now, that's not to say that the OPEC powers didn't try to weaponize their control of the oil sector. We'll see many other examples of that. But I think if you have an unstable political system, at the same time you have very powerful states weaponizing the flow of materials, as soon as you possibly can, you need to sort of move away, you need to diversify your sources, or you need to think about, can we do without rare earth metals at all? And the unfortunate answer to that question is the green economy utterly depends on rare earth metals. So to your question, if the United States owned all of the rare earth metals, mining and refining and so on activities, and started to weaponize that, would I push back? Yes, absolutely. I think that would be a major problem. But have they done that? Would they do that? Who knows? Under Trump, they might well do. But I don't know. I think it is an imbalance in today's economy, which is very dangerous. And I've seen it, as I said, in Japan, at very close quarters. That doesn't mean that China is automatically wrong, that it won't at times sort of come up with incredibly sensible solutions there. But I was also in China when they shot down one of their own space satellites with one of their own rockets to demonstrate to the United States, you think you've got power because you've got space satellites up there. We can knock out any of those anytime we like. And when that happened, I was in a room which was predominantly Chinese people, and the level of nationalism, Britain was one of the most nationalistic countries in human history, but the level of nationalism was extraordinary. And I've worked in Japan, so I've seen the nationalism there as well. But I worry about anyone who's trying to strangle bits of the global economy to get a political outcome. But again, thank you for the question. I'd love to know what your answer to that same question would be. My email is john@volance.com. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for the question, and thank you, John. Other questions?
Or comments?
There's
There's
one
right at the
over
back.
there. Yeah, or comments. Absolutely.
I have a question regarding labor rights within a capitalist system. Labor rights have been cultivated and acquired in many cases throughout history by the bargaining power of labor. So after, for example, after the Black Death in Europe, what happened is that farmers began to bargain for better wages, better living conditions from the landlords, and that practically began to weaken the feudal order. Now, and the same thing with industrialization and the threat to strike and stop the industrial machine. Now there is this term that's being circulating, the techno-feudalism, where the workers don't have the bargaining power anymore, because in any case, your work could be automated. So in that sense, how do you see a sustainable society? A sustainable society, one of the things is not just the environment, it's the people. How do you see there be power to the people when they could be done without when it comes to business? Every task could be automated, and it's not only the digital work anymore, there is the work coming from robotics and deployment of robotics in the factory system. So how do you see the balance to be achieved? Thank you.
I love that question because of the historic framing, going right the way back to feudalism and the Black Death and so on. How many of you watched the wedding in Venice of the Bezos couple, Jeff Bezos and his delightful wife? Some of you did. Some of you will also have seen that Jeff Bezos has announced that robots are going to take on many of the roles that human beings currently play in his business, Amazon. So I think you're absolutely right to say we're moving into a techno-feudalism era. Does somebody like Elon Musk care anything at all about ordinary employees? No, of course he doesn't. He'll get rid of them as soon as he possibly can. What's the whole robot taxi story about? It's getting rid of taxi drivers. And that's just one part of what's coming at us. If you look at his truck, it's not out on the roads as far as I'm aware, but I mean, that's basically going to remove 2 million truck drivers in the United States. If you think about where somebody like Donald Trump draws his political support, it's from people who feel deeply uncertain about the roles in which they currently occupy in their economy or society. And what we've had is a hollowing out of the United States economy because of competition from other parts of the world. If you then start to take out, say, 2 million truck driving jobs, which are highly skilled, highly paid, and so on, you create a political dynamic which becomes, over time, unmanageable. So I think the tech community is building a deeply unstable society. So to your question, how would I see a sustainable society? I can't. I genuinely can't. I look back at the early years of the trade union movement, and I see people being killed, imprisoned for trying to represent labor, worker rights, and incredibly courageous people, campaigners, communities, and so on. The trouble is that over time, institutions go rotten. And much of the trade union movement around the world didn't go rotten exactly, but it lost its sense of purpose. It became much more interested in preserving the institutions rather than driving the social change agenda. There will be people here who disagree with me, but it's part of where my critique of the UN comes from as well, because I think it's very often become less about change in the world than trying to keep the old order that we've all grown up in. It's a fantastic question. The simple answer is I simply don't have an answer. I don't think any society will ever be stable or sustainable. You look at the pharaohs or the kings in ancient Egypt. They may have gone on for hundreds of years or collectively thousands of years, but with all sorts of radical changes along the way, wars and all the rest of it. So I don't have a utopia that I can sort of put in a silver tray in front of you and say, this is the future, work towards it. I think whatever we work towards is going to be incredibly dynamic and need constant awareness and innovation and so on. But that's an attempt to answer almost an unanswerable question, and thank you for it.
Thank you very much, John, for a very stimulating talk. I wonder where you are with the role of government policies on achieving that. You mentioned electric cars, for example.
Yeah.
Many companies have actually rolled back their investments in electric cars because they're not selling enough and people are getting very anxious. And many governments have actually withdrawn the incentives that they had before in the United Kingdom, for example, as well as the US. So I think that there's hope, a big hope, I think, of achieving much far better progress if governments are more attuned to the issue of policies that actually nudge people in that direction. Yeah. The other thing is the ethical side of things, ethical side of businesses when they make decisions. I personally believe that capitalism at heart is not very ethical, so they would basically go for whatever profits they can make regardless of the impact, the long-term impact on the environment and stuff. This is a big issue. I mean, how do you tackle something like that to persuade people to be more ethical in their decision-making, to value more the long-term effects than the immediate profits and so on. The final thing is I'm interested in urban morphology and urban regeneration and stuff like that. And some of the methods that look at that try to model the generation properties or the generation process. Like, for example, having better high streets or better connected high streets and more public spaces would lead to some kind of social regeneration if they focus on that. And again, that's linked to public policy, linked to how you teach people how to design and so on and so forth. So that was more of a comment than a question.
That
Thank you very much.
was a complicated comment and question, but fascinating, and I'd love to continue the conversation. Let me just say a couple of things. I was about to say I'm not a capitalist, but I have sold companies that I've developed. So in some ways you could say, like it or not, I have elements of that sort of capitalist mindset. I do not think that capitalism is the automatic or best solution to the problems that we face. It just happens to be the reality in which we find ourselves. I've visited enough communist or ex-communist countries over time to know that that approach to communism doesn't actually deliver better outcomes either. The one thing to be said about capitalism that's sometimes said is it tends to die with its failures. I mean, if it doesn't succeed, unlike communism, which props things up for a long time. But what we have now is governments wading in to protect endangered industries and so on. So, you know, government intervention can be very positive. I think Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, I think the European Union's Green Deal, all of them were well intentioned and to some degree gave government oxygen in a way to green technologies and companies built around those. I have to just declare something which is very personal. I've worked with government. When I worked in Egypt in 1975, I worked with government. I visited at one stage in a project that we were doing, Dr. Ali mentioned Lake Manzala. I came across a problem, which is that there were 3 different study teams that had cut up Manzala into 3 different areas. And each one of them was saying, doesn't matter what we do here, because 2/3 of the lake still exists. But if you I was the first person to put all of those maps together, I thought, this ecosystem disappears. I then went to 17 different ministries and agencies in this country in the 1970s and tried to get them to pay attention off my own bat. This was the UN sponsoring projects, but they didn't want any part of that. I did it. I then came back from that to London, having failed absolutely to get the government to do anything about it. And we have a magazine called New Scientist. I rang them up and said, would you take a story on this? And they took it. They gave it a cover and 4 pages inside. And it should have been, I said it yesterday, but it should have been career suicide, because I shouldn't have done that. We'd signed a non-disclosure agreement. The point I'm trying to make is government is often profoundly dysfunctional in some of the things it should be doing that it doesn't know how to do. I also was 7 years within the European Commission on a body trying to bring sustainable development into every part of the Commission. It drove me bananas. Sorry, it made me quite anxious at different times, because you could put all the energy you have into trying to get change. And I'm used in business to people saying, no, that's a stupid idea, or I like that idea, let's try it. And then perhaps even changing their minds later on. Whereas in government, I mean, you can spend an entire lifetime trying to get change. So government, fascinating, absolutely central role to play. Regulation, enforcement, intelligent, innovation-based policies, all highly desirable. But if people here are working on how you get that practically in a meaningful timescale, I'd love to know more about that. But thank you again for the comment and questions.
Okay, is this the last? I don't know if I'm the last question. I feel like it should be well thought out. Thank you, John, for your talk. So I just, maybe you can give some advice to people, perhaps. So I'm a social activist in Egypt. I'm an animal rights activist, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, so actually I'm really pleased because we just got all our laws confirmed for animal abuse, and the Minister of Agriculture is on board. So I think listening to your talk can sometimes be a little bit disheartening, because obviously we've seen what corporations have done. You know, we've seen Pepsi and Nokia and Apple all vouching to be, you know, better, and then they haven't. And of course we've seen lots of stuff in governments, and governments covering stuff up, you know, the US and recently Epstein. So I think it would be really useful for maybe you to give us advice about how, as individuals, each of us can maybe try to make the world a little bit better. Because I think a lot of the students here, you know, maybe they'll go to work in corporates, maybe in startups, and sometimes you can get dislodged or disconnected from the world, from the environment as well. So I think it would be great to hear from you about how you think that we can all contribute individually or even collectively to make the world a better place, perhaps.
Well, firstly, thank you for the work that you have done and will do on animal welfare. Many, many decades ago, in 1988, with a very young colleague, Julia Hales, I wrote a book called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months, went into 20 foreign editions. It was extraordinary. But the one disagreement that she and I always had then was about animal welfare. And for me, animal welfare is fundamentally part of a humane, just, fair society and so on. For her, it didn't really matter. And I felt, and that's not against her, it's just, it's a widely shared opinion in many ways. But I think animal welfare is crucial. First bit of advice, I make a career out of giving advice. Everything comes to the public health warning. What do I know about the future? I'm just trying to give you a rather personal judgment. Marry the right person. Have a life partner or have family support which sustains you through the reverses that you will inevitably experience. This is not going to be an easy ride. If you're picking this space because you think it's going to be the golden road to wealth and all the rest of it, do try and think a little bit harder about it. But will you enjoy the ride? Will you find it worthwhile? When you're on your deathbed, will you look back at what you've done as an individual or as an organization or through networks? This is the most extraordinary space to be in. And my second piece of advice is very simple. In everything I've said, you could take away a message of saying, oh, forgive the technical term, but we're screwed. I mean, everything is going against us. But it's those moments where suddenly people, back to the horse dung issue, when people wake up to the fact that something is profoundly wrong in the world, they start to become agitated, and out of that agitation can come all sorts of things, revolution, whatever, but also innovation. And that's one of the reasons why I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be so incredibly exciting. Because there are all sorts of people, I've met some of them here, and in Cairo on this trip, who are working on solutions to these great problems. And it's very easy to go back to the days when Henry Ford was working on this smoky little metal object and to dismiss that, saying, you know, that's going nowhere fast. And yet there are these moments where suddenly things that we've dismissed, things that we thought were impossible, things like getting ordinary people to care about the welfare of animals in their ownership or whatever, those shifts happen. And I mentioned slavery. In my own country, that was an impossibility, that you would ever end that incredibly wealth-creating nightmare of an economy. And yet it did. And at that point of time, back to the question about government, the British government spent 40% of its national income for 2 years, this is going to sound horrible, to buy out the property rights of slave owners, to stop the trade. And the question that's at the back of my mind is, will we have, as societies, will we have to buy out the property rights or the pollution rights of the oil and gas and coal industries? And my answer to that is, if we need change on the urgent scale that we need, we're going to have to invest in kicking companies like ExxonMobil, kicking companies like BP, Shell out of the market, because they are in many ways criminals. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, John. It has been wonderful working with you for the past days. And I'm sure there are more questions, but John made his email available. So we're going to be sending you a lot of emails.
Thank you, Carmen,
I expect that. So thank you so much, John. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your input. Thank you.